Hello there, Scott Spann here from my sailboat office here in Sausalito, California. I want to give you a bit of a caveat here. This is going to be a long video, and so I'm going to create a way for you to jump ahead to different parts of it if you're particularly interested in certain sections of the video. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that in the description with the timeline or if I'm going to do it in the chapter section with clickable links. I've not done that before, but I'm going to try to figure it out just for you, just for this longer video. But anyway, be forewarned. This is the whole story, the big picture about how one solves impossible problems. I made this presentation, first of all, to the board of directors of Pioneers around a subject we were calling applied networks, but how do you actually build a network from diverse individuals all the way out and up through a network that's able to sustain itself over a span of a decade or more. I also presented it at the University of California, Berkeley, to a graduate class on, it's a master's development program on how do you do social change projects at scale based on the United Nations development goals. So both of these were audiences of people that really appreciated the presentation, thought there was a lot of value in it, and so based on that, I'm going to do that whole presentation for you here. Get it done as quickly as I can. So I'm calling this solving impossible problems because most people think it's impossible to solve them. I would offer you that it's not impossible. I've done it in a variety of settings, in corporate settings, in social settings, in governmental settings. I've done it for HP around tripling the output of the global supply chain. I've done it for Apple around the introduction of the iTunes and the iPod in Japan and Europe. Done it around affordable housing, did it in Guatemala working with guerrillas, former guerrilla leaders on one end of the spectrum and the military and the intelligence services on the other end of the spectrum. I've done it with the White House around their digital identity project and the Navy around their subfleet. So it's been applied over the last 15 or more years in a variety of cultures, industries, situations. And so it's pretty well proven process. Now I'm saying that it's on the path to emergent impact. And the reason I'm saying that is because and you'll see later on in the video that the problems that we're facing today are complex problems. They involve complex adaptive systems. And in complex adaptive systems, hierarchical approaches don't work. The solutions themselves have to arise from within the system itself. And that's why I'm calling it emergent impact. And if you do it right, if you ensure that the solutions emerge from the ecosystem itself, then that leads you to what I'm calling effortless leadership. And I'm calling it effortless leadership, and you're going to hear me say this again and again, not because I'm into some altruistic state or some idealistic state or because I haven't led organizations, which I've done. I've been a CEO and a COO and all that other stuff. I've worked for venture capitalists and hedge funds. Effortless leadership simply means that we can't keep working harder and harder. I mean, if we're struggling, something's out of alignment. We all know the experience of effortless performance. You know, we've whether it's in music, whether it's in athletics, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in the way you facilitate lead a meeting or lead a team, we've experienced effortlessness. And if we know what we're doing, it is effortless. Driving a car is effortless once you know what you're doing. So I'm going to offer that it's effortless to solve these problems if we know what we're doing. And I'm going to offer to you here what I believe is the way to get that done. So let's jump in here. So we're going to branch two ends of a spectrum here. We're going to look at, you know, part of this information comes from how do systems work. And I've spent a long time coming to understand how different kinds of systems work when I was a rolfer. It was the human system of the physiology, psychology, kinesiology, anatomy, how that whole system worked. When I was a trauma psychotherapist, how does trauma work and the system of trauma and the nervous system relative to trauma. When I was a developmental psychotherapist, what are the different developmental stages and how they unfold, whether you're looking at it through, you know, Freud's lens or through Margaret Mahler's lens of emotional intelligence or Piaget's lens of cognitive development or these other lenses you could look at. And of course, studying, you know, system dynamics and systems thinking and having built models and built maps. So if I understand systems on one end, and then on the other end, if I understand how individuals work, which I got from those things I just told you about, Rolfing and trauma therapy and the other things, then I've got the two ends of the spectrum. And I can work my way in toward the middle, and that's what this has been. And the other thing here that I want to talk about is being for something versus against something. And the reason I'm talking about that is right now there are a host of networks that are trying to form in resistance to what's going on in the economy or in the environment or in our political system. And a good friend of mine, Mickey Connolly, has talked about when I find myself fearful or not very creative or stuck or anxious, it's typically because I'm in the presence of what I'm against. If I can get myself in the presence of what I'm for, then all of a sudden my body relaxes, my breath deepens, my mind opens up, my creativity returns. I want to also offer to you that neurologically and physiologically, we're designed to be for typically. So if I'm mountain biking and I'm thinking, don't hit the rock, don't hit the rock, don't hit the rock, you can pretty much guess what happens. Or if I'm snowboarding and I'm thinking, don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree, you can again guess what happens. But if I'm thinking, where's that narrow path that I want to make my way through, my body just naturally goes there. So there's a lot to say for being for something versus against something. Not that against isn't also necessary. And I'll use Egypt as an example in this case when we're talking about applied networks or scalable networks or emergent impact. In Egypt, if you remember the book, Gayi Waib, I believe his name is, he did a book called Revolution 2.0 where he described how they'd used Facebook to mobilize people to turn out in protest against Mubarak. And they successfully removed Mubarak because they were against Mubarak. Well, look at Egypt today. They weren't really clear about what they were for. That wasn't well articulated. They weren't moving towards something. I would want to suggest to you that we need to be against certain things, but we need to be against certain things in the context of what we're for. And that's when it works really, really well, because Egypt is in a very, very bad place now, and I'm not sure when and how they're going to be able to recover from that. So let me tell you a story about how this can work. And I'm going to use Guatemala because it's an example where there was a lot of conflict. When my good friend Jim Richie Dunn and I went into Guatemala, we'd done a piece of pro bono work for them, and we had said to them at the end of that piece of pro bono work, I said, well, if anyone is ideally positioned to solve for poverty in Guatemala, it's CARE Guatemala, because you understand the fundamental dynamics of poverty. And they're like, the what? And it turned out that the fundamental dynamics of poverty weren't really clear. In Guatemala specifically, they'd been working for over 20 years, doing better and better projects, hiring smarter and smarter people, getting better and better results, raising more and more money, and poverty and social injustice were getting worse and worse and worse over time. That's kind of akin to pressing the gas pedal in your car, the engine's revving up and you're slowing down. You know, and there's smoke coming out from the hood. There's just something's not aligned, something's wrong. That's not effortless. So we were able to go into Guatemala. We were able to interview a 360-degree snapshot. We interviewed, Jim and I, about 30 different individuals. We modeled their little worldviews. We were able to assimilate those little worldviews into an integrated map of the ecosystem as a whole. And then we were able to bring the people from the differing factions into the room and take them through the map. And through that process, they were able to see that the problem they were having wasn't personal. It was structural. When you, in the president's office, grant a favor to a big donor, a big presidential supporter, say it's a tax break or something else, or an expenditure, you don't realize that 3 years from now, that road that would get my people's produce, my community's produce to market, doesn't get built, and my economy collapses. You're not doing that to try to destroy my people. You're doing that to satisfy your local goal, unaware of the unintended consequences across time and space and the impact those have. So when these individuals were able to see that, they were able to then begin to organize. And when we went in there in the beginning, CARE Guatemala had no relationships whatsoever formally with anyone in Guatemala City, with the government of Guatemala. All of their relationships, as I understand it, were out in the field, out in what they call the interior, with individual communities, doing individual projects in these communities. Once we got through with this process, they were able to organize a network of relationships such that former guerrilla leaders were invited to go to military briefings to understand what was going on for Guatemala militarily. The health minister set up a network of online where you could see which NGOs and which government entities are doing work in which localities, so that they were able to coordinate their activities inside of different communities for the betterment of the communities as a whole. So this allowed conflicted individuals to come together and to form a network that actually was able to do far better work in Guatemala than they had before. Now, I want to acknowledge here that you folks are really, really smart. So I'm going to want you to test this as you go. And we need really smart people thinking about this, and you'll see why in a minute. And I'm asking myself, what am I trying to cause here? Well, I'm trying to cause a step change in how we go about solving these kinds of impossible problems. A step change in our ability to create emergent impact and to make leading these things relatively effortless, because we can't keep working harder and harder and expecting a better result, a different result. I want a step change in understanding about how we solve these kinds of problems, whether you use this methodology or some other. And I want a step change in our ability to innovate about how we solve these kinds of problems. And there are innovations coming, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. But those innovations have to occur at scale, given where we are as a population, given where we are in terms of our natural resources, where we are politically, globally, all those things. So, and I want you to be a choice at this and to make choices in this as we're talking. So I would ask you to pick something that you're working on, your own impossible problem, your own complex multi-stakeholder issue that has lots of moving parts and lots of individuals that have to coordinate to solve it, that would require a systems view and a networked approach to solving this sort of a thing. So pick that. And so now we're going to explore the questions about, so then how do we design for this? How do we launch such a network? How do we evolve such a network? And then how do we do that at scale? And I'm going to apologize here, because if you've watched many of my videos, you're probably going to hear some of the stuff that said again, but this is the big picture. This is the whole enchilada. And you may already know a lot of this stuff. So hopefully that little table of contents thing that I come up with works out for you, for all of us. And you can skip those parts and just get into the stuff that you want to know more about. So I'm going to give you 3 contexts first to get this rolling. So this is fundamental hypothesis I've been working off of for about 10 years now. And so imagine this. On one axis, we have this number of issues, and I also see them as opportunities, because the promise in this situation is that we have to come together and we have to get really smart and caring in order to solve these problems. So there are issues, yes, but there are also opportunities. And they're unfolding over time, all right? Well, there's this line that I've been concerned about for 10 years now, which is the rate of emergence of these particular kinds of problems. And they have 2 fundamental characteristics. They're complex. They got lots of moving parts. If you and I had all the resources we thought we needed to solve them, they're not straightforward. We wouldn't know where to start. And they're multi-stakeholder. They require, as they did in Guatemala, not just people who haven't worked together before, but people who've actually been in battle together before, whether it's inside of an organization or inside of a community or across a whole nation, to come together to solve these kinds of problems. That's the characteristics that determine those problems. Now, what troubles me most is that our typical ability to solve them looks like this. And some people say I'm being really generous there, that actually when you apply our typical solutions, that you actually make the problem worse, not better. But let's just say, even if it is making it slightly better, the problem is that the rate of emergence is outpacing our ability to solve them. And so what I'm most concerned about is our bigger issue or opportunity, this gap that's emerging between the rate of emergence and our ability to solve them. So that's what I want to focus on here. So that's one thing that's driving me here. The other thing that's got me here that really helped me, and this came up several years after I had this fundamental hypothesis kind of insight, was this complexity mindset. I'm indebted here to Dave Snowden, who he calls this the Cynefin framework, and I've trained with Dave, and this is one of the things that I find most valuable in my learnings from him, is this framework that he built on this. This is the work of Max Boisson and others, but he's taken it to another level where he's integrated this. So let me lay out a couple of frames here. So I'm going to call one of these dimensions of reality relative certainty. Now let me point out here, several of my friends, my brothers and sisters in minorities especially, in disadvantaged communities, have pointed out to me that certainty is a relative certainty for the dominant or ruling class or group. Okay, I typically talk about relative certainty compared to relative uncertainty. I used to cite the 50s and 60s and say that was a relatively certain time when we knew where our food, our energy, our water, even our income was coming from. Today, that's not so. That's highly unstable today. A lot of uncertainty there. But back in the 50s and 60s, indigenous peoples didn't have that. African Americans didn't have that. Hispanics, other kinds of immigrants didn't have that. So this certainty and uncertainty is a very relative term, but I hope you're kind of following me here, that there are sort of stable and then more unstable environments. Maybe that's one way to talk about it. But imagine these two kinds of worlds we're living in. In a world with relative high degrees of certainty, simple and complicated systems work pretty well. They're well designed for that. In a world of uncertain world, the systems there that operate the best are complex adaptive systems and chaotic systems. You find those in those dynamically changing, high rate of change worlds. In a simple system, there are clear cause and effect relationships. They're evident to everyone, and there are right answers that exist. The example that I use is my 62 Chevy pickup. It's pretty straightforward. There's a right answer. There are not three ways to fix the car, typically, unless you're using baling wire or something else. In a complicated system, there are cause and effect relationships. They're discoverable, but they're not immediately apparent to everyone. And there's more than one right possible answer. I use my Volvo XC60 as the example there, that it's a very complicated machine. I can't fix it. My mechanic typically can't fix it unless he can plug it into the computer and the computer analyze it. In a complex system, there aren't right answers. There are emergent instructive patterns. So think about economic patterns, think about stock market patterns, think about political patterns. In those kinds of, think about environmental systems, think about the patterns of climate right now is a big one, where there are emergent patterns that are telling us things, but there's not right answers to those things. In a chaotic system, and here I think about, say, Katrina as a kind of a hallmark example. There's no clear cause and effect relationship. There was, the levees collapsed due to the storm, but it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Right now, there's no point in looking for the right answer. You've just got to respond. You've got to get people out of the water, off the roofs, get them shelter, get them food, get them, medical attention, whatever it takes. But that's what happens in a chaotic system. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon here that Dave describes in an HBR article, where he talks about if you don't know which one of these systems you're in a state of disorder because you're likely to apply your favorite decision-making or leadership methodology, but it may not fit the context. So, and an example of that is if you try to take a complex problem and you try to simplify it, which is such a typical thing that we do because we got to be able to act on it. If you oversimplify it, then you will drive it, and that's what this little fold at the bottom of this graph is intended to indicate. You will drive it into chaos. So think about it. If we say 3 strikes and you're out, or just say no to drugs, or no new taxes, those were all extraordinarily oversimplified responses to very complex situations where we didn't go in and think about them carefully. And we actually drove our infrastructure now in the United States into chaos. We're at a D+ or a D by most engineers' assessments of our bridges and roads and buildings. We've blown our prison population completely out of control with the 3 strikes and you're out, hard and fast, oversimplified rule, and so forth. Enough said about that. So, what are the approaches you take to simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic? Well, in a simple system, you sense what's going on, you put it in a category, and then you respond. And if I go back to my 62 Chevy pickup, it's spark, it's fire, or it's air, if I remember right. and so I go in, I sense what's going on, I put it in one of those 3 categories, and then I narrow it down and respond to that. And there are best practices. You either you've got to replace the rotor, you got to replace the distributor, or you've got to replace the spark plugs, or whatever that is, or you got to put gas in the tank. There aren't a suite of things you go do. You go do one thing, and it's a best practice. And hierarchy is really good at that, because in a hierarchy, you design the structure of the system to determine the behavior and to constrain the actors in the system to do very specific things. Think of a factory floor. That's another great example. It's a factory floor. It's a fairly simple structure. There are best practices at each step in the production process. You can see the whole thing. Hierarchy works great. In a complicated system, you sense first, then you analyze, and then you respond. And there's actually a suite of good practices that you can apply. On my other Volvo that I had before this one, there were 3 ways they could fix this. They could fix it mechanically. They could replace the transmission. They could fix it chemically. They could put a $40 chemical in the thing, believe it or not, that had been developed by one of the big motor companies based on a recall they had. Or they could work with it electronically through the software to change how the thing was shifting. So I went with the $40 option and avoided having to put in a $1,200 transmission. And there are other examples of that. And again, a hierarchy works really well there because it's stable. The system's very stable. There's a high degree of certainty there. Here you can think about a plant. If you think about like a Chevron's plant here in Richmond. It's a very complicated, but it has clear cause and effect relationships in that thing. let's go to a chaotic system. Let's go back to Katrina. As I said before, you just got to act. You got to get the people out of the water, off the roofs, get them, shelter, get them food, get them medical care. Then you can step back and say, okay, what have we got? And now you can start to craft a response. Now, what you really want in there is that the solutions are typically very novel kinds of solutions. And what you want is a beneficent, intelligent autocrat. Now, unfortunately, many people judge the responses that we had when we got people out of the water and taken care of was we didn't come up with novel solutions. We applied our same old hierarchical solutions to rebuilding New Orleans. We didn't have a beneficent, intelligent autocrat to restore the kind of vitality that we had and the diversity we had in New Orleans. So we got a very different kind of an outcome. But at any rate, you want a beneficent autocrat in that kind of a system. In a complex adaptive system, you probe first. Now, the reason this model made so much sense to me is I was a trauma psychotherapist. And as a trauma psychotherapist, I couldn't just ask a psychotic or someone on the edge, tell me about your trauma. That's not a probe. That's my going in and trying to categorize something or analyze something by having them tell me the story. I had to probe first because I didn't know how that system, that nervous system of that human being was going to respond. So I'd have to say something like, well, was it warm or cold? Was it light or dark? Were you wearing, was it night or day? Or were there leaves on the trees or not? Was there snow on the ground or not? What I'm doing there is I'm probing this complex adaptive system and I'm noticing, does their breathing shift from their belly to their upper chest? Do their shoulders tighten? Do their eyes fixate? Do their carotid pulse start to beat faster? Have I started to overstimulate that system such that I'm pushing it in the wrong direction? So I would probe, then I would sense through those different modalities, and then I would come up with the next level of response. So it's a very much more real-time kind of a response process. And you can probably guess from that, then the response itself, the solution set itself is emergent. It arises from my interaction with the system. And the same is true in a political system, in a market system, in an economic system. You'll see people doing things inside of a system and the system will respond. And the thing about a complex adaptive system is, unlike a hierarchical where the structure determines the behavior of the actors, in a complex adaptive system, the actors and the structure or the system are co-evolving. An example of that would be, there were tax policies intended to redistribute wealth so that we didn't get this polarities in our economy where people had to give significant portions of their wealth upon death. They had to give that to the government, and then that got redistributed to the population to keep the population to keep these polarities, these inequalities, these inequities out. Well, some really smart insurance person came up with an idea. That is that insurance policies, the proceeds from life insurance policies are not taxable under inheritance tax laws. So they said, well, here's what you do, wealthy individual. Just prior to your death, buy a $20 million or a $200 million or a $1 billion life insurance policy from me. And I'm bastardizing this a bit to make the point, but buy that policy from me. Then when you pass, I take those assets and then I give the billion back, or the million or whatever back to your heirs as a distribution from a life insurance policy, and you don't pay any taxes on that. Well, now the actors in the system have just gotten around the structure of the system and they've caused the system to now change. And that affected the redistribution of wealth in a way that's now a part of what's contributed to this, this growing inequity in our economic system. So that's why these solutions to these systems have to emerge from within the system itself. And that's best done if the system itself can be self-organizing, not dominated by some sort of a hierarchy or something. Because basically, that example I just gave was a certain percentage of the population, an effective economic hierarchy, imposing a solution onto a complex adaptive system. So that's the general lay of the land. All right, now what are we doing? Because I just got through saying that complex adaptive systems are not, they're not clear cause and effect relationships in them. So what we're doing in this work is we're taking systems that are basically chaotic. Now I'm calling this chaos in the sort of negative sense of the word, not when we want to invoke chaos to cause innovation or creativity. But generally when we think of chaos, like a Katrina, there's destruction happening, damaging happening. And I would offer to you that most of the systems we're in today, whether it's our educational system, our prison system, our tax system, our political system, our economic system, they are destructive systems. The challenge here is that they're destructive over a time span that we can't clearly see, so we're not noticing it. It's that sort of a boiled frog metaphor, which is a false metaphor, by the way. It doesn't really happen that way, but it's like that. So we're taking a chaotic system, we're going into that system and asking from other people's perspectives, what's going on. We're reducing that deliberately to a complicated cause and effect understanding. We're taking that cause and effect understanding, that systems map, and we're simplifying it by doing an analysis to say, these are the places that we all agree we need to act. And that map and that analysis, that simplification, is emergent from the system itself. And so then we're going into that system and probing to test those hypotheses, doing what are called safe to fail probes. That is, we're probing in ways that won't blow up the system, that we can learn from the system by sensing and then responding, and get into dialogue with that system and restore healthy, complex, adaptive function in the system. That's what we're doing through this approach. So that's the value I've had out of this way of looking at complexity. All right, now let's talk a little bit about self-organization, because it can sound chaotic, it can sound in its own right, it can sound crazy, anarchist, or whatever. But there really are some simple rule sets at place. Now, this is an example of a piece of software written by a complexity scientist back in the 1980s, if I have this right. I think it was a guy named Chris Reynolds, if I have that right. You know, when you've seen like 40 or 50 or 100 starlings just flock, I mean, they're going along a certain way, and all of a sudden they all turn, and you're like, how in the world did that happen? Well, Reynolds was trying to figure that, like, there must be a simple rule set. Is there a simple rule set that solves for this? And so he sat down and he actually figured it out. And this is a much more elaborate version than what he originally came up with back then. Back then it was triangles on a computer screen, and that served as what he called boids, B-O-I-D-S. You can look this up on the web, and it's a takeoff on androids and birds and like boids. There are 4 simple rules that determine this behavior. The first one is separation, like just don't bang my wings. The second one is cohesion, don't get so far apart that we're not a flock. The third one is alignment, follow the average heading of the 3 birds in your field of view. And the fourth one that I like to talk about is avoidance. Don't hit a building or a tree or a rock, you know, a cliff, a mountaintop. And that's what that red ball is to signify there. Now, if you program these little agents with those 4 rules and turn them loose, they do this. Now, I'm not saying that this is how birds operate. I have a feeling they're a lot smarter than that, and they're not managing these rules all the time. But my point here is that what looks like incredibly complicated, really hard to manage behavior can be described with 4 fundamental rules. Now, in this case, that green ball is an evolution of this model, and I would make that akin to a purpose in an organization or a movement or a network. What's our overall purpose, and are we all following that purpose generally, and is that helping to organize us further? So there are those 4 simple rules, and so the trick for us is to come up with what are those kinds of rule sets that govern the behavior of an applied network of individuals working toward a common outcome, whether it's social change or any other kind of change. I also want to talk about another kind of a rule, I would call it, that's emergent. So there are these 2 lines here. One, the top one is very low frequency, low amplitude, high frequency interactions. The bottom line is low frequency, high amplitude. Now, the bottom line is much more what we've tried to do as a civilization, and that is, think of the Soviet Union when it did 20-year plans. That's a very high amplitude, a really big planning effort, very low frequency, every 20 years. We used to do it in corporate planning. A guy wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. In fact, he was the president of the American Association of Strategic Planners at the point in time he wrote the book. But it was about how these strategic plans don't work. The world's just far too dynamic for that now. When we used to do 5-year plans, when I did a lot of corporate strategic planning back in the 80s, that's gone by the boards. In the 90s, we were down to 1 year to 18-month planning cycles. Nature is much more like this low amplitude, high frequency exchanges. Our heartbeat, our breath rate, the rate of change in the day of tides or things like that. They're very low amplitude, high frequency exchanges. So there's another way to think about some of the kind of rule sets we need to be putting in place here. So Reynolds came up with that in the Boyd's work. Christopher Alexander came up with it in architecture in his book, A Pattern Language. He talks about, he looked at architectural designs all over the planet in different cultures, and he was looking for what are the patterns that describe what makes for harmonious, nourishing space and what makes for space that has dissonance and that it doesn't feel good to be in. And he came up with a very small set of patterns that can resolve those things. Stephen Wolfram, who wrote Mathematica, guys, a genius. This is the software used by physicists and chemists and mathematicians to run really complex mathematic problems that we couldn't run before he ran this software. Were really hard to run. He wrote a book called A New Kind of Science, and in there he posits, it's a big, thick book. I don't recommend reading it. It's a long read. Fundamentally, he's talking about the fact that nature's not as complex as we think it is. It is the interaction of very simple rule sets that, when these simple rule sets interact, they create these incredibly complex, like fractal-like outputs that we perceive as being very, very complex, but they're driven by very, very simple rules. So this isn't new. This is doable. This exists in physical reality. All right, so the initial conditions that I've seen so far, having done projects like this for a number of years and been thinking about it for a long time, is I see four things that I can consistently go back to. The first one is what I call purpose, or purposes. And by purpose, I mean, what's my purpose? What's our purpose? What's the team and the organization or the movement's purpose? And are our purposes aligned? And they typically can be aligned. They have aligned at different levels, but they typically can get into alignment. And so making sure that work we're doing serves our purpose. And then to make sure that it serves our purpose, we have to be at choice about what we want to work on, and what we want to contribute to in the network. So, and whether we as a part of the network want to act on this initiative or another initiative, but we have to be at choice if we're going to be free to follow our purpose. And then if I'm going to pursue a purpose and I'm going to choose to do something inside of a movement or with a network, then I need to know that there's reciprocity. And by reciprocity, I mean that either I'm giving to the network and the network's giving back to me, or I'm giving to the network and you're giving to the network, so that I'm not out here holding this all on my own. And in order for me to know that that's true, that that's happening across the network, that we're pursuing our purposes, that we've made the right choices, and that there's reciprocity in this, there needs to be transparency. We need to be able to see how the network is progressing relative to its overall goal, to the agreements we made, and relative to reality itself. So those are the four things that consistently show up as initial conditions that have to be put in place. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how those play out here in a minute. So we're going to talk now about, remember those questions we talked about, how do we design, how do we launch, how do we evolve and sustain? So we're going to look at emergent design. So here's the structure of what I call emergent impact or effortless leadership. We're fundamentally creating relationship and clarity. Now those two things are critically important. The relationship side of the equation is largely the psychodynamics of the thing, the group behavior, the sociology, the individual psychology. That all falls into the motivational behavior, Cialdini's work around what motivates individuals and what causes individuals to act. That work falls largely in this relationship side. The clarity side of the equation is all the system dynamics, systems thinking kind of tools, causal loop diagrams, behavior over time graphs, different kinds of analyses, that sort of thing. Now, the key here is that we have to first get into relationship before we're able to get clear. And we're doing that at 6 organic levels: the self, with another, a team, an organization or network, with our constituents that can be a marketplace, and at the ecosystem level. Now, when we do that, when we get into relationship and clarity at the level of the self, then for the first time, if I'm in relationship with myself and I'm clear, then I'm able to lead. And you're able to determine whether you want to follow me or not. If I do that with another, if you and I get into a relationship and you and I get clear with each other, that's when we begin to build trust. If we join a team and the team gets in relationship and gets clear, that's when we're able to start to innovate around a problem. And that's why we form teams, is to innovate, to create innovative solutions. If an organization gets into relationship across itself and with itself and gets clear, that's when you execute, because you form organizations to do things that teams alone or a team alone couldn't do. You want execution. At the level of constituents or a marketplace, that's when you get in relationship with the market and you get clear with the constituency, that's when you're able to figure out how do we get to scale with this thing. They'll help you figure that out, actually. And then at the level of the ecosystem, when you get in relationship with the ecosystem as a whole and you get clear about the ecosystem as a whole, then you can design for sustainability. The example I often use here is the Segway. When he developed the Segway, he had a beautifully scalable device that the market really, really wanted. However, when he came to San Francisco and asked for permission to run the segways up and down the sidewalks and on the streets and stuff, he got turned down. And what had gone wrong there is he hadn't thought through the sustainability by, by getting into relationship with and getting clear at the level of the ecosystem. So these boxes are intended to represent actual tools that get done inside of these different levels to build relationship and clarity at these different levels. All right, so the fundamentals. There are 4 emergent questions we have to ask. And the 4 questions are, what's the state of reality? If we can't agree about the state of reality, we won't go any further. And I'll offer you that climate change is the best example here. So with climate change, for a while there, we couldn't get an agreement around the state of reality. It's getting hotter. No, it's getting colder. It's permanent. No, it's temporary. We finally got a critical mass of people to agree that no, reality is changing. It's getting consistently hotter. And the climate's getting more and more unstable. And it's not temporary. Now, once we were clear about that, then we could, and only then we could step into the question about, well, what's causing that reality? Because if we don't agree that it's even happening, and I see this happening with, oh, customer satisfaction is falling. No, it's rising. No, it's stable. You know, and like, well, if we're not agreeing about the state of reality, we're not going to get into what's causing that reality. But once a critical mass of people got clear about the fact that climate change was real, then we could start to enter into that conversation about what's causing that. Now, for a while there, we had quite a variance around that. Well, the sun's getting hotter. No, it's the burning of fossil fuels by humankind. No, it's a cyclical event. No, it's a religious event. I mean, we had all kinds of speculation about what's causing that. Well, finally, a critical mass of people agreed that the burning of fossil fuels at the rate we're burning them is what's causing that reality. Once that was clear, then we could move, and only then, to the next level of where do we intervene in that reality to change that state of reality. That's where we're now at that level of conversation. Okay, renewable energy, energy efficiency, that whole conversation is happening now. Now, we've not truly agreed there because we haven't bought in whole hog to those changes. Once we agree to the changes that have to be made, once we're willing to accept that the intervention means winding down fossil fuels really quickly and spinning up clean renewables really quickly, and energy efficiency, then we can start to have the healthy conversation about how do we make the structural and then behavioral changes. And I say structural then behavior because in a system, the structure is designed to determine behavior. When I was a rolfer, you changed someone's structure and their physical function changed. You change the structure of someone's nervous system and their behavior changed in trauma therapy. We create tax policies to change behavior. We create transportation systems to change commuter behavior. We know that changing structure changes behavior. That's why we change the structures. The interstate highway system, for example, changed our behavior radically and our economy radically. So now we haven't yet gotten to that conversation about climate change, but when we do, we'll be able to make those changes in a way that actually works for society as opposed to does damage in society. Now, there's an emergent approach that's fundamental to this. And so we're building leadership, relationship, and clarity. And we're building that first at the individual level when we do individual interviews and individual maps. We're then building it at the subgroup level, the next level of organization around particular themes. Then we're doing it at the level of the whole group, and that enables strategic action then at the level of the ecosystem. So let's walk through a little bit of that. Here's an emergent pathway, the emergent pathway that we typically follow. So at the individual level, and I'll show you examples of this in a minute, we'll do individual interviews and individual maps, and we're picking a 360-degree snapshot of the ecosystem, as many stakeholder views as we need to get clear about that. And we're picking people that have the credibility, the knowledge, and the influence such that when we build out this map, we come up with this strategy, and we start to move into 90-day projects, that we're going to be well positioned to actually have the relationships in place to actually act on the solutions we come up with. So it's really important who you pick to do those interviews and who we pick to do those interviews. And then we build out those individual maps and we reflect those maps back to them and say, do we really understand your goal, how you think your goal gets achieved at the highest level, and so forth. Once that's clear, once we've done this 360-degree snapshot of these individual maps, we're able to do a couple of things. One, we use those individual maps to construct the integrated map. We don't just like patch them together. We actually imagine we spread these maps all out on a table or the floor or the wall, a bunch of them, And we ask ourselves, okay, now all of these different stakeholders actually do somehow fit together in physical reality. And for us to be successful, they're going to have to fit together in a cooperative way in physical reality. What's the system that describes how all that fits together? And so we create that map. Now, the other thing that happens from there is we're able to have spoken to these people, we're able to figure out like, well, there are these 4 or 5, maybe 7 different thematic reasons why people are doing the work they're doing. And one example was, people were doing some things with the REAMP project in 2004 because there were those that were concerned about local economic development. There were those that were concerned about safe, reliable, economical energy for a 21st century economy. There were those that were concerned about the environment. And there were those concerned about policy and how do you create good policy. And they were 4 distinctly different groups. So we were able to identify those groups and then have them come together and participate in a fact versus an opinion-based conversation called a behavioral time graph and create an integrated map. Now let me tell you why this subgroup step is so important. And this has to do with something I learned from a woman named Yvonne Agazarian when I trained with her in what's called system-centered group psychotherapy. There's this thing she pointed out that's really, really interesting, and I'm going to bastardize it a bit. Forgive me, Yvonne. But here's how I interpret it. She said, you'll never get a diverse group of individuals to have an authentic conversation because they're so concerned about being seen, heard, understood, and appreciated. And you have to, and included, you first have to be able to discriminate and understand the differences among the apparently similar before you can appreciate and integrate the similarities among the apparently different. So what that means is we have to take those that are already think that they're alike and put them together and let them work through their stuff before we put them together with opposing groups. So in the REAMP project, for example, this project was at the time that they brought me in was on the edge of collapse because they hadn't paid enough attention to the relationship side of that equation. They'd focused more on the clarity, the systems thinking side, but not the relationship building side of the equation. So there was actually a memorandum being circulated to among 5 of the key leaders there to try to sabotage the process so they wouldn't have to come back together again. So when I came back in, we really had to build relationship. So when we identified these themes, and at the beginning, I wouldn't have been able to put the environmentalist group together with the utility group because the charge between them was so great I couldn't have created a container that would have held that. But I could put all the environmentalists together, and sure enough, when we put them together, and the utility and regulators and so forth, sure enough, when we got in the room, there were probably 10 or 12 folks in that particular group because they could go to any one or all of these groups that we put together. And for the first 5 minutes or so, they were all patting each other on the back and, hey, we could have this conversation just to ourselves and with nobody else in the room. But within about 10 or 15 minutes, there was a bit of a fuss going on, like, well, and I'm exaggerating here, but it's the air, no, it's the water, it's the forest, no, it's the oceans, they found out that they actually had significant disagreements about what was most important in the environmental space because we were trying to get them to come up with a shared goal. Now, the beauty of it was the charge between them wasn't so great that they couldn't find resolution. And once they'd been through that process of having differences and resolving them in a fact-based way, they were then much more able to that was the differences among the apparently similar, they were much better positioned to then come into conversation with those groups where they thought that they were able to then see the similarities among the apparently different, like with the utility. So that's what the subgroup piece is about. Once that's done, then we move into a whole group, organization, or network, depending on if it's what size you're working with. And we do an analysis of the map because they've gone through the integrated map as a part of the subgroup. We're able to identify the leverage points inside of that map, and then we're able to use that to come up with a strategy over a 2-day intensive. And then we move into the market and ecosystem phases where we engage in these cycles of 90-day projects. That's those low amplitude, high frequency, safe to fail probes inside the market is what those 90-day projects are about. So that's the pathway. So let's dive in a little deeper. Here's an example, and I'm not going to walk you through this one. This is from the Vermont Farm to School project. We did 20 individual interviews and maps. We looked at everything from the economic value and the educational value of farm to school to the how do you generate demand through the school boards and the schools themselves, through how do you ensure supply, through the farmers and the food processors and the distribution networks, to how do you actually ensure the market's able to cooperate to ensure that all that happens, that it gets delivered to the school, whether it's the food or the educational value and all that. So we did these 20 individual interviews and maps. Here's an individual one. The important thing here to point out is that you're going for on a goal on one of these things, to the degree you can get it, is you want a measurable, a positive, measurable, time-specific goal. That crystallizes something. Our neurology actually changes when we have a measurable time-specific goal, a positive measurable time-specific goal, in a way that's not present if we don't have a measurable time-specific goal. If we just say we want to improve local food adoption in the school system, you wouldn't, when here it says you're gonna create the initial conditions to move from 44 to 60% local food by the end of school year 2015-16. Very specific. Mind starts to think really differently. Directly below that then are what I call the key drivers. They have more formal names like key resources or key stocks, but these are the key drivers that directly cause that goal. And then everything else that they tell me, the other 20 or 30 things that are in an interview, typically sit underneath those key drivers. They don't directly cause the goal, they cause the driver, and then in combination, those drivers cause the goal. So we did 20 of these, and out of that, we were able to come up with these different subgroups. We had ones on, if I remember right, government, on local community, on school systems, on supply and demand, and we did a behavior over time graph. So what does this look like? So we put them through a process, and I'm not going to go through the details of how we do that. That's covered in another video on the behavior over time graph. You can find that on my blog if you look for it. They came up with a goal, which was establishing the true value of a healthy, socially just, and sustainable food system, and its contributors, catalyzing cultural change. They really wanted to cause a cultural change through the school systems, where kids had the experience of being able to set out to change their food system by growing their own food, harvesting their own food, and then marketing their own food inside the school and outside the school, processing their own food, serving their own food, having control over their food supply. And so at a level of 10 then, what that looks like on a scale of 1 to 10 is that the children are now empowered and engaged. But if that's not happening, we ask the group, what is it like when it's failing? And then we've got malnourished and fearful children who think they can't control their destiny. So then we say, okay, what's the time frame over which we have to look at this? Well, we go back to 1920 and said, well, if we go back to 1920, we can see what's happening, because before that, we were in a reasonably good shape relative to this goal that we had. We had decent food at least. So at this point, you say, well then, where were we in 1920? And someone says 9, and someone says 3, and someone finally says 7. And then you say, well, what has you say is it a 7? And then they start to give facts versus opinions. And so then, and people start to learn from that. They learn in ways that they wouldn't learn if you said, read these articles, read this book, watch this video, or whatever. So what then happens is you say, okay, well then, which direction does this go, up from there, or across from there, or down from there? And they say, oh, down, down, down. And then you say, okay, at what slope? And then they tell you. And then when does it start, for how long? And they say to here. And then what does it do? Well, it goes up. And at what angle? And you say, well, why does it go up? And they say, well, World War II happened, and we began to be more, the Army was very concerned about nutrition because they needed soldiers and whatever. So the point here is that every time this slope changes or there's an inflection point of any kind, I'm asking them, what has you say that? And so now what's happening is the whole group is exchanging all this information and learning and getting into deeper and deeper relationship with reality and with one another as they exchange information. So eventually they get down to today, and now you can see what the system is doing here. It's headed down. And we ask them, well, unless something radically different happens, significantly different happens, what's it likely to do going forward? Well, it's a system. And all of those same things that are happening are continuing to happen as far as they can see. So the system's their goal is going to continue to get worse and worse and worse over time. Now, this dotted line is a bit of an anomaly. This dotted line is what they believe would happen in Vermont, because Vermont had made some very specific changes. But at best, they were going to kind of flatline. Then we ask the question, okay, in order for this goal that you really care about to really come alive, to have a chance of surviving, what has to happen by when? And you can see this is a very steep line. They believe by 2025, they have to get to a level of about a 9. Now that's an incredible gap between either where they are or where they think the rest of the nation is and where they think farm to school needs to be. So that's that gap that creates the dynamic tension out of which the desire to innovate. And in Guatemala, when we did the work like this, Jim Rucci-Dunham and I, my friend and colleague, we had them embody, internalize in their nervous system And by the way, Robert Fritz describes this process in his book. Um, we had them hold inside their belly, like the worst that could happen and the best that could happen. Because what we found in Guatemala is all the cynics, the people who've been there 8 years or more, were on this line, and all of the optimists, the people who've been there 3 years or less, the idealists, were on this line. And neither cynicism nor idealism was going to solve that problem. So a true leader has to be able to embody what's likely to happen and what needs to happen, hold those two polar opposites in their nervous system, and it's out of that the ability to innovate arises. So let me show what that looks like in terms of the state of being that people have to inhabit. So we did a thing before this saying, what's the state of being you have to inhabit in order to solve a problem like this? It's kind of a typical, consultant kind of question. And people gave typical participant kind of answers. Oh, we have to be inclusive, or we have to listen, or we have to think out of the box. Or they'll say these politically correct things, but they have like almost no energy to them. But once you do this process, they're taking them through this behavioral time graph process. They say some pretty out loud things, and there's a lot of energy to them. We have to be courageous. We have to be excited and scared. We have to kick ass. We have to be non-compromising. We have to cause a revolution. We have to be unwavering. You get these very high energy statements and states of being from them. And I believe that's because they're in tighter relationship with themselves because they've espoused a goal and that goal is growing, has been accepted by others. They're in tighter relationship with reality because they see what's been happening to that over time. And that enhanced relationship is what causes energy to arise in one system. When you're put in the presence of physical reality, when you see someone who's injured and needs help, you have a natural impulse to go do that. When you see something unjust happen, you have an impulse to go do that. You may thwart that impulse depending on the circumstance, but you have an impulse. So I believe that's what's going on here, is that by putting people into relationship with one another in reality, their energy level is going up. And we're going to need that energy as we move through time to solve this, because there are going to be times when, we're going to struggle a bit despite, the fact that we've done an emergent process and we're on the path to effortless leadership. They also, through this process, came up with a shared goal. It took a little longer than kind of what I'm showing here, but I'm not going to read through this. But again, you'll see it's positive, it's measurable, and it's time specific. And they have an abbreviated tag for this goal, which is, I believe, it's 75, 75, and 50 by 25. And that's how they name that goal. But you can notice how if you read that goal, you'll start thinking about, how do I solve for that? Your brain works in a different way than you just say, let's just improve the farm to school food system. So that's the goal. Now, I'm not going to take you into detail on this map. I just want you to know that we did at that same subgroup meeting for each of these subgroups, from that perspective, with that energy, we walk them through this map to make sure we've got the map right. And we're asking 3 fundamental questions. Is this your world, all of its parts, all of the pieces, all of the relationships and the dynamics of those relationships? That's what the arrows are. Is when this goes up, yes, this goes up, but this goes down. Do we have that right? And the second question we ask is, does this explain your reality? Like why it's behaving the way it's behaving, and how it's likely to behave, how it could behave if you tuned it properly, if you resource certain aspects of the system in a better way. And then the third question we ask is, can you see yourself here? Because if you don't see yourself in here, then number one, the map's not right, because a key stakeholder perspective isn't in here. And secondly, you're not going to play. I mean, why would you, if you're not in this thing? Now, Emergent Launch, once we have one of those maps, we're able to do an analysis of the map, and we run through a series of analysis. We do a thing called a cross-impact matrix analysis, commonly known as a MICMAC, which is a piece of software developed by the intelligence services, or used by the intelligence services to identify nodes of high opportunity in networks of greater uncertainty. That gives us like a handful of leverage points inside the system mathematically. We look at system archetypes like success is successful, tragedy the commons, fixes that fail, drifting goals. There's a whole host of them, 9 to 11 of those, that we look at and see if those are present in the system. We look at how the different resources are trending over time, and so forth. I won't go through all those right now, but we do an analysis, and out of that comes a set of leverage points. And those leverage points then are what we're able to come to consensus about acting on. And when I say come to consensus, we're not insisting on consensus. Consensus emerges. It's really fascinating. When you follow these steps, it emerges. So let me jump forward into what that looked like in the farm to school work. Here's their goal at the top, and then here are the 4 key domains from their map at this top line here. The relative value of farm to school, the market coordination and network, the demand, and the supply. Now, this isn't the order they appeared on the map. This is the order that they need to be acted on in the system. That's the other thing you come up with in the analysis, is you come up with the sequencing of these things. By the way, the leverage points are down below here. What's the relative economic value and educational value and the ease of use and things like that. Now, what's important about this is that so many people have a right answer. I think, as Ken Wilber has said, he's never met anyone that's 100% wrong, but there are relative truth, like there's a hierarchy of truth. And in this case, how that applies here is that these levers, people's answers typically are correct. They just need to happen in a certain sequence. We can't, yes, you have this right answer, but we can't do that right answer yet. We have to do these other three things before we can act on that thing. So we get clear together about what we think the levers are and what we think the sequencing of the levers are. And then we allow people to choose which of these levers do they want to work on, much like we let them choose which subgroup do they want to attend. So here's the overall flow then, is that we step from that into a strategic offsite with this analysis done. And we review and finally approve that shared goal, that positive, measurable, time-specific goal you saw before. We review the levers to make sure we're all up on that and there's no second thoughts about that sort of thing. And then we ask people, which of these levers are you attracted to? Which one do you have energy for? Because we don't want you working on something where you don't have any energy for it. And then each of those teams that self-forms, self-organizes, creates a goal for that lever, a measurable, time-specific, positive goal. And then they come up with strategies. And the reason we want strategies is because we're going to need to engage in several safe-to-fail probes. These low-risk, low-amplitude, high-frequency interventions in the system. And we want a portfolio of those things to choose from. And we want people thinking out of the box. So we want a lot of things to choose from. And then we pick one of those that we want to first start with. And we come up with the phases of what that work looks like. So we begin to get that a little more grounded. And then with those phases, we then say, okay, what's the one next step that we want to take? And then what are the tasks of those phases? And what are the tasks and the roles required? And we do what's called a RACI chart or a Darcy chart. You may have heard of it. Who's to be, if it's Darcy, it's who's the decider, who's to be accountable, who's responsible, who's to be consulted, and who's to be informed. We choose different ones of those depending on what the group wants to do. And then once all that's clear and we present it out to everyone, and we do self-critiques inside of this, and there's a whole process for that. That's another video. Then we do a reality check. On a scale of 1 to 10, we've done all this good intellectual processing. How do I feel about this? What does my gut tell me? Scale of 1 to 10. And then we work that stuff out. And once that stuff is clear, then we've completed the strategic offsite, and we ask people, are you ready to take one more step? Are you ready to engage, to consider, to explore a 90-day project? And when we step into the 90-day project work, that's when we talk about, and that's a separate meeting. It's usually a day-long meeting as opposed to the strategy was 2 days. We talk about, why do we do 90-day projects? Well, they're low-risk, safe-to-fail probes. There's a low investment on the part of a foundation. Foundations are typically happy to fund them because they're very small dollar amounts with quick turns. They're not going to blow the system up if they don't work. We immediately extend the momentum of the strategic offsite and all that work. We design them to achieve a significant impact. It's not the whole goal, not the 2025 goal, but it's significant impact. And it embeds a fundamental shift in the way work gets done. And that's important as we try to transition from being a hierarchy to being a network, because we've all been raised in we were born into hierarchies. We went to school in hierarchies. We went to work in hierarchies. Our government's a hierarchy. So we've got to embed that shift about what does it mean to work in a network. We set a 90-day goal for that lever. We come up with strategies for that 90-day goal. We pick one of those, and again, we determine the phases of that, and those are usually pretty quick because it's 90 days. And then we go to that, what's the next step we're going to take here? What are the tasks, the specific tasks, and the specific roles and accountabilities for that? And then we do a reality check on that. And then we step into the 90-day project. Now, did I tell you here? Let me go to this slide and then I'll come back. So when we did this with the Farm to School Network, we did the 20 individual maps. We had 60 participants show up in the subgroups. We had 40 people show up for the strategic design. We had 35 people show up for the 90-day teamwork. We did successful 90-day projects. The first round was quite successful. All of their projects, they made a funding request to the Vermont Community Foundation. All their projects were funded. And it was reported to me that the foundation said this is the most comprehensive and cohesive set of requests we've ever received. We're funding them all. And we're funding Betsy Rosenbluth, who leads this project, who is the Sherpa or the guide, or she helps heard the network. We're going to fund her for 18 months. And then after a few more rounds of these 9-day projects, they came back and said, you're the most successfully performing project in our portfolio. We're wanting to offer you an unsolicited grant of $200,000. Just tell us what you're going to do with it and it's yours. And which had never happened before, to get an unsolicited grant of $200,000. And now the state is talking about giving them $500,000. And similarly, they have to apply and tell the state what they're going to do and how it's going to work. So it's been a very successful project, and we have similar stories to tell about other projects like Reamp and others. Let me step back now to that slide about, so how does this thing get sustainably, this sustainability level? How does it become an embodied network? And so what I've created here, and I'm not going to walk you through every bit of this because there's a lot here, but I will cover this in subsequent videos. It's what I'm calling a flight manual in the spirit of the Boyds, and the fact that, you know, you got to learn how to fly one of these things. There are some things you have to be able to do, and you've got to make this transition from a hierarchy to a network, because there's no such thing as being kind of half network, no such thing as being half pregnant. So these are self-organizing mechanisms and protocols, and there are 3 things that you've got to be able to do. The network got to be able to stay. You got to be able to stay, and this is at the level of the network, the team, and the individual. You'll see on that left-hand axis over there. You got to be able to stay in awareness at the level of the network, the team, and the individual. You've got to be able to stay aligned as a network, a team, and as an individual. And you've got to be able to stay in action. We can't have anything blocking action, because that'll kill momentum in a network. That'll kill impulse. That'll kill that, kick-ass, a revolutionary spirit quicker than anything, is if we got all this red tape, this bureaucracy to go through. So how do we stay in awareness, alignment, and action over time? Now, this grid, these are the tools that got deployed in this particular project and have been deployed in other projects, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will point out here, if you look at this one here, it's the ecosystem map. Now, let me say something about this grid. This grid is designed in such a way that anything that's in the upper left-hand corner applies typically across and down. So let me give you an example of that. And the first thing here is the ecosystem map. That's the first thing that causes the whole network to become aware. That same thing causes the whole network to get aligned about the structure of the reality. And that whole map causes the whole network to be able to get into action by seeing where are the places we need to intervene. Sometimes you can see that without even going through much of an analysis. And I've had projects where that happened. That same ecosystem map increases the awareness of the network. We've already said that. But all of the teams now, they're aware of how they fit on the work they're doing inside the network as a whole. And an individual working on a particular aspect is aware of how their work they're doing fits line of sight with the rest of the organization. This happened with HP when we modeled their global notebook supply chain, when they were trying to triple the output of their global notebook supply chain over the course of a 3-year time period. And when we proposed doing this work, they said, Ike Harris, who was running the supply chain, said it's impossible. We said, fine, we'll do it for free. A month later, we'd done it and we got paid. But that was the first time that individuals inside the supply chain were aware of their line of sight contribution to the overall supply chain. So I'm not going to, then there's the strategy map, and then there's a dashboard where we all see how we're moving. That's the transparency part that I talked about on those initial conditions of purposes, choice, reciprocity, and transparency. So the same thing across this whole landscape. These are the tools, these are the mechanisms, these are the protocols that you invoke in order to make sure that this network can actually function sustainably over time. We've talked about that. So speaking of time, in the work I've done with environmental groups and with others, we're talking about the rate of destruction or the rate of chaos or that's happening in our world today, whether it's in the economic systems, the political systems, the prison systems around affordable housing, or whatever it is. And then we're talking about the regeneration if it's going well. And even in these best case scenarios where we're actually doing things to make the world better, these lines aren't converging. They're moving away from each other. We have got to shift. We've got to make that step change, a quantum leap in how we solve these problems. And we only have so much time to get this done in. So, and I see that as a positive thing. That means we have to get our stuff together. We have to figure out how to do what we know we're capable of doing. I mean, we're innately designed to collaborate and succeed. We've just been taught not to. Most of us want to live lives of meaning and belonging. Most of us are trying to do the right thing. It's just not straightforward in a complex system. There are all these beliefs that I have about humans, having been a trauma psychotherapist and a developmental psychotherapist and trained in group psychotherapy, that make me know this is true, that those lines can converge, but we don't have much time. So the question becomes then, what's the human technology? And when I say human technology, I mean, yeah, how you and I have a conversation, how you and I do work together, but I also mean, like how do we use our iPhone and an app to stay aware, to stay aligned, to stay in action with one another toward a common outcome? And so that's the question I'm pondering now, is how do we stay in relationship and clarity and action at scale? And I'll show you one last thing, that if we look at what people are talking about, how networked organizations operate, and then if we look at what a map looks like, and then if we look at the two of them side by side, it looks to me like this systemic approach to coming together, forming a network, and acting as a network seems like a natural fit to me. And I want to know if it feels like a natural fit to you. And so the question that we're exploring here is, how do we create emergent evolution at scale? How do we get better and better and better as a species over time at scale? So I hope this was useful to you. I know it was long. If you've made it this far, kudos to you. I think you should go out and have a good stiff drink. I have some añejo tequila that I keep over here when I need that. If you're watching this anywhere other than at my blog, scottspann.com, please head on over there. Leave me a comment, like me, unlike me, but tell me why you unlike me. Let me know the kind of complex problem you're trying to solve, the impossible problem you're trying to solve, the leadership thing you're struggling with. Let me know the kinds of things you want to explore here, because I really want to help solve these problems, because we've got to solve these problems. And if you solve your problem, I'm pretty sure I'm better off, and my kids are better off, and my grandkids are going to be better off. So let's do this. And regardless of what you choose to do from here on out, I hope this finds you thriving today. Take good care. Bye-bye.